Hello dear students and welcome to a class on American literature. Today we are going to have a discussion on the poem Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking by Walt Whitman. So let's have an introduction to the poet Walt Whitman. Whitman was born in a farming community near Huntington, Long Island. When he was 4, the family moved to Brooklyn, but Whitman continued to spend much of his time visiting his grandparents in rural Long Island, becoming familiar with the countryside and with the shores of the Atlantic Ocean nearby. After only 6 years of formal education, Whitman left school at the age of 11 to work as an apprentice printer, and that was mainly because he had responsibilities to his family as a second son. He worked as a printer, as a school teacher, and even pursued a career in journalism as well. At the same time, he began writing poems and stories which were sentimental, imitative, and unimaginative. His famous poems include O Captain, My Captain, and When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. These poems were written on the death of Abraham Lincoln. From 1855 until his death in 1892, Whitman devoted himself to the growth of one book of his, and that was Leaves of Grass. He also did other things at the same time. He was a newspaper editor from 1857 to 1859, and during the Civil War, he visited soldiers in the hospitals of Washington, bringing them solace and companionship. In paying tribute to Whitman, Rabindranath Tagore once said, I quote, "Whitman is the highest name. In poetry, one must have originality and spontaneity, and that breadth of thought which tells you that the poet has seen deeply and knows humanity. Whitman gives me pictures, unquote." So this was what Rabindranath Tagore said about Whitman. Whitman found a multiplicity of wonders to celebrate in his poetry. He saw all objects and persons interrelated in a single oneness. By writing about what he knew most intimately, he could at the same time write with validity about all men and their brotherhood. He saw democracy as the form of society which would allow the fullest and freest development of each man's self, would bring out each man's divinity. Whitman is the closest thing America has had to a national poet, the poet of American optimism and pragmatism. Now let's think about the title of the poem, Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. The title of this poem significantly condenses the theme and the form. The subject matter is the process of poetic creation, which is imaginatively transformed into a little drama played out by a boy, a bird, and the sea, striving to discover the meaning of experience and arriving at the word death. So ultimately, the theme of the poem is death. What comes out of the cradle endlessly rocking is death. The cradle symbolism takes us back to childhood. The central hero of the poem is a child. The poet is a grown-up man. He recollects a childhood memory, and the original title of this poem was A Child's Reminiscence. The poet relives the childhood, thereby performing the Wordsworthian act of recollecting emotion in tranquility. The connection between childhood and adulthood is what the poem establishes as a process. The phrase endlessly rocking brings in the symbol of the sea. The sea is at once the cradle and the grave. Even modern science tells us how life originated in the sea. So the sea is the rhythmic bridge between birth and death is the final word that comes out of the sea. Thus the title compresses into a single line the entire complexity of the music and meaning of the poem. The poem opens with a general description of the nature attendant on the drama in the poem. Almost every line opens with a prepositional or adverbial particle, and the verbs take the ing form, giving a sense of swinging motion. So if you can just read through the first part of the poem, you will understand that almost every line begins with a prepositional or adverbial phrase, and this is intended to give the poem a swinging motion. So the cradle image endlessly rocking becomes the key to the central symbolism of the sea, which conceals within it the secret word death. The atmosphere is created by the child coming out to the seashore, surrounded by the landscape and the seascape, the flowering bushes and the waves. The child and the grown-up poet are equally present with all the feeling aroused by the sights and sounds of nature, the distant hills, the low-hanging moon, and the emotions transformed into words, and all the words thus aroused centering on one key word, namely death. The child is the father of the man. You know the famous line. The child feels what the man translates into words. Therefore, this section concludes with a passage that sums up Whitman's attitude to poetry. I quote, "I chanter of pains and joys, unite of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them." So we must have a deeper understanding of these lines. I chanter of pains and joys, unite of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscence sing. This famous passage may be called a condensed expression of American romantic poetry. A reminiscence, that particular word, recalls Wordsworth's emotion recollected in tranquility, or Keats's almost a remembrance. The word sing implies lyricism, the romantic singing voice characteristic of the poet. In the first line, the word chanter is used. Poetry has the quality of a hymn or rhythmical ritual sway in its expression. Whitman's concept of poetry is founded on dialectics, that is, the balance of opposites, pains and joys. And we are reminded of Shelley's "I'm cradled into poetry by wrong," and also his line, "I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed," on the one hand. And on the other, we are reminded of Keats's line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." So thus we understand that poetry is a blend of Shelleyan pains and Keatsian joys. On the one hand, Shelley talking about the pains, falling upon the thorns of life, bleeding, and Keats talking about the joys. Perhaps Whitman unconsciously echoes Aristotelian pity and fear also. At any rate, poetry is a reconciliation or balancing of emotions. The phrase "unite of here and hereafter" is a more involved one. It implies transcendental philosophy of time and eternity, of mind and body, of history and timelessness, of reality and imagination. The poet is a uniter of these cardinal points. He uses the words as a bridge. For example, in the poem "A Noiseless Patient Spider," Whitman symbolically suggests the same idea. The spider launches forth filaments out of itself in order to connect two promontories. The poet issues forth words with which he unites here and hereafter. Hence, Whitman's theory that poetry is a language experiment, a special way of using words to explore reality, can be found here. He continues to give greater definition to the function of a poem. The poet takes all hints to use them, and then he leaps beyond all these. This means that nothing is lost on him. He devours all experiences. The true poet does not exclude anything from his purview. As Shakespeare says, the poet's eye rolls from heaven to earth and earth to heaven. And then what is the poet actually doing? He uses all these experiences, he takes all the hints, and he transforms them into something that is rich and strange. And that is what he means by saying swiftly leaping beyond them. So after having gone through all these experiences, the poet transforms them into something that is totally different. So then there is a serious conditioning phrase in Whitman, "but swiftly leaping beyond them." Look at that line, "but swiftly leaping beyond them." This phrase implies that the impersonality that the poet must attain. He must gain complete mastery of his subject matter and manipulate it into art, that is, transform that into something rich and strange. This is the art of singing a reminiscence. It is more than Wordsworth's emotion recollected in tranquility. In Wordsworth, poetry is the product of an unconscious process. In Whitman, poetry is the process itself. This is what is indicated by the poem "Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking." The progress of the poem is operatic. that is through recitative or narrative passages and arias or singing voices. The narrative tells the story. Once on Pomnock Beach, two birds, a feathered guest from Alabama, built their nest on a bush and laid eggs spotted green and brown. The boy saw the birds crouching on their nests and singing. The boy was curious to know more about the birds and approached them, never too close, never disturbing them, but cautiously peering, absorbing, translating. The birds sang a joyous song of love. Then suddenly one day, the she-bird disappeared and never came back. The he-bird sang a new song. It was a note of grief. It was so touching as to cause tears. At this point, the poet who writes the poem intervenes to tell us what happened, though as a child he did not know. He called on his mate. He poured forth the meaning which I of all men know. So that's a quote from the poem. He called on his mate. He poured forth the meaning which I of all men know. In these two lines, Whitman establishes the unity of life. What he does is not unlike Wordsworth's famous statement, the child is the father of the man. Wordsworth's meaning is that the child instinctively knows what the grown-up man labors to learn. So the child knows, but the grown-up, the adult, is laboring to learn something. The situation in the poem is similar. The child listens to the cry of the bird. He is moved to tears, thus establishing a primal sympathy to the bird. The grief is felt, but its meaning is not known. So the child feels the grief, but he does not actually know the meaning. The emotion is felt, but the meaning is not known. The grown-up poet says the meaning was encoded in the bird song, but in the absence of language, the child did not understand the meaning. The poet knows because he has the words which lend meaning to the experience. So the child feels it, but he does not have the language. And what happens is that the adult, the poet, has the language, he might lack the experience. This is where Whitman advances upon Wordsworth. Wordsworth tries to link up childhood and old age with a mystical uniting power of natural piety. Whitman is more modern in telling us that it is language that distinguishes adulthood from childhood. So the child experiences, but he does not have the language to communicate. The adult has the language, but he is lacking the intense experience like the child has had. Poetry is a language experiment according to Whitman. Poetry is the art of finding appropriate words for human emotions. When Wordsworth says emotions are recollected in tranquility, he falls short of the discovery of language as the instrument of recollection. Whitman is more modern and more philosophical than Wordsworth in emphasizing poetry as a matter of using words. Even at the opening of the poem, he tells us out of the endlessly rocking cradle, what emerges is the word of all words, death that contains all meanings. The area collects together all the images of external nature which the poet recollects from his childhood memory. The work of the poet is therefore to find words for the abstractions of memory. So the poet has had the experience, he's recollecting it from his memory, and now the poet's duty is to get the correct language, get the correct words for the abstractions of memory. Here Whitman describes the very process of the change over from boyhood to poetic adulthood. So look at the transition coming over there. From boyhood to poetic adulthood. The boy becomes the outsetting bard. The change, the boy becoming the outsetting bard. It all becomes the ecstasy felt by the boy. The waves dally with his bare feet and the air dallies with his hair. The song of the bird filters down his ears into the soul. Then the pent-up love in his heart is loosened and tumultuously bursts out and appears as strange tears coursing down the cheek. There is a drama with the colloquy. The three characters, the trio, the bird, the boy and the sea, are participants in it, each one with her or his own voice. The boy and the bird are speaking in an undertone, while the sea, the savage old mother, cries incessantly. There is a harmony between the questions that well up in the boy's soul and the rhythmic beatings of the sea waves. Evidently, some drowned secret is hinted at in hissing sound that the sea produces. The word hissing generates the image of a serpent, and we cannot exempt the original image of Eve and Satan in paradise. Nature is deliberately called the savage old mother to give us the impression that nature is, in the ultimate analysis, a destructive force, concealing within her the terror of death, but also the souls of life. When death and life move on the same wavelength, the poet is born. Whitman goes on to describe the powerful effect the song of the bird works upon his consciousness. The child wonders whether the bird is demon, spirit, or an ordinary bird with its recognizable body. Just think of Shelley calling the skylark blithe spirit and Keats calling the nightingale dryad of the trees. The child is not certain whether the bird addresses him. The effect is that consciousness is awakened in him. He does not have the talent for speech, but his soul is excited and 1,000 songs wake to life in him. It is as though this one song quickens in the child what Wordsworth calls the still, sad music of humanity. The bird's sorrowful song is the catalytic agent of all the sorrows in the human race, and the new poet is born. So this sad song stirs 1,000 songs inside the consciousness, inside the soul of the poet, and a new poet is born. In a sense, the poet has lost his childhood innocence. He can never be the same again. Whitman describes the poet in two memorable lines: the messenger there aroused, the fire, the sweet hell within, the unknown want, the destiny of me. So that is, the bird's song has aroused 1,000 songs inside the mind of the poet, and he can never be the same again. He has been converted into a messenger. The messenger inside the poet is aroused. The fire is ignited. The fire, the sweet hell within, the unknown want, the destiny of me. Now these are phrases that echo back and forth other poets. Messenger recalls Shelley, who turns the west wind into a messenger of his philosophy. The fire stands for poetic inspiration, almost suggestive of Shakespeare's fine frenzy. The phrase sweet hell within implies Whitman's dialectics of poetry as a blend of heaven and hell. The unknown want is, of course, a phrase that put forth the romantic concept of life, what Tolstoy calls divine discontent. All these phrases add up to create the destiny of me, that is the role of a poet. That is, the song of the bird has made the poet or has created the adult person into a poet. So there is a transformation. The man has been converted into a poet. The boy finally turns to the sea to find out the clue to the mystery of the bird's song. The clue must be hidden somewhere in nature. He has already had the experience felt within. Now the unknown want is awakened in him to know more. This is Whitman's theory of knowledge. Knowledge begins as a sensation, as Wordsworth says, felt in the blood, felt along the heart, reaching the purer mind. When once there is felt experience, it clamors for intellectual understanding. It is this desire for more knowledge that Whitman writes about. If I am to have so much, let me have more. The knowledge that the poet seeks is in one word. It is the word final, superior to all. This has a biblical echo, because we have heard of the verse, first was the Word, and Word was the Lord. The sea is the archetypal source and symbol of creation. Everything begins from the sea. Therefore, this secret word must also come from the sea. The boy wonders. The ceaseless hissings of the waves contain the mysterious word. It is whispered by the sea as it strikes against the sands. What is distinctive about Whitman is the simple, sharp realism of his description. The phrase liquid and wet sands is the exact description of the seashore. The climax of the encounter between the boy and the sea is now reached. The lines echo the rhythm of the beating sea waves, delaying not, hurrying not. The sea now acts like a nurse swinging the cradle, whispering into the ear of the child some sweet, lisped word that will pacify him. The word is death. At last we have arrived at the object of our quest. Every word produces its own special music, hissing, melodious, rustling, creeping, laving softly. It is almost a confidential word that the sea shares with the child. This is dramatically conceived and recreated. The sea edges towards the child privately, rustles at his feet, creeps over his body, bathes him, and then softly gives the suggestive word death. The word death uttered by the sea is the sea's revelation of its own secret, which is the unity of being. Emerson said that the universe is contained in every one of its particles. Now, the same thought is echoed in Whitman also. Earlier I talked about this interconnectedness. What is there in the universe is there in us also. It's like being the same. Now, just as Emerson said that the universe is contained in every one of its particles, what Whitman also said, as I said, is the same. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, and it contains the same thing. Whitman made a powerful metaphor on the physical unity of being in the lines of his work, of his poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which means that what is there in the universe, what is there outside, is there also in us. And in the poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, this is exemplified. I quote from the poem, I too was struck from the float forever held in solution. I too had received identity by my body. That I knew was of my body, and what I should be, I knew I should be of my body. So there is this oneness of being. The float, which is mentioned, is a liquid in which all substance is dissolved, so that every drop of float contains all that the whole is. So we living in the universe, we contain within us everything that is there in the universe. Just like that, everything outside us is also containing everything that is there in the universe. And death is a process by which separate individuals are returned to the unity of material being. Death is the constant evidence of this unity. By the word death, as the sea utters it, is not a fact of someone dying, but an idea of unity. It is a strong and delicious word for the poet. So that you have to be very careful with that. Death, as it is mentioned here, does not mean the process of someone dying or being separated from others, but rather it contains within it a unification, an idea of unity. So through death we are becoming again a part of the whole universe. So there is this sense of unity there, and therefore it is a very strong and delicious word for the poet. In the concluding passage, all the images characteristic of the rest of the poem are collected together and organized into a kind of epilogue or coda. The birth of the poet is at the moment of his theory. So actually, Whitman is making a theory about the birth of a poet, about the birth of a poet. The song of the bird becomes a central symbol. The child has an experience, he recollects that experience, and this song, the sorrowful song of the bird, has awakened in him 1,000 responsive songs. From all these comes up the key to all the mystery of life. The word of the sweetest song and all songs, the strong and delicious word death is given. And the roar of the sea also becomes very significant. The sea is described or imaged as some old crone rocking the cradle, whispering the word death into the ear of the child. So this is how Whitman sums up the whole poet, converting a childhood memory, converting a childhood experience, using the language of an adult poet conveying a message to all the people, and that message is about death, how death becomes a process of unification. It's not the fact of someone dying, but an idea of unity, and thus it becomes a very strong and delicious word for the poet. I hope you have understood the whole poem. Read the poem, then listen to the description, then again go back to the poem so that you will be able to connect what is being said in this video and with the lines of the poem, and then you will have a deeper understanding of the poem. So learn carefully, listen carefully, read carefully, and also stay safe and stay healthy. Take care. Thank you.